A poor single mom texted a billionaire by mistake asking for baby formula money. What happened next was unimaginable. The glow from Lillian's cracked phone screen illuminated her tear-stained face in the darkness. It was 2:47 a.m., and Layla's cries had finally stopped, but only because her tiny body had exhausted itself from hunger. The last scoop of formula sat empty in the container on the counter, a silent testament to how far she'd fallen. 3 months. It had been 3 months since Nelson walked out without explanation, without a backward glance, without a scent of child support. 3 months of choosing between electricity and diapers. 3 months of pride slowly dying under the weight of reality. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She'd sworn she'd never beg him, never give him the satisfaction. But when your baby is crying from hunger and your bank account reads $4.23, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. She typed slowly, each word a small death of dignity. Lillian's text, "Nelson, I know you don't want to hear from me, but Layla needs formula. I lost my second job today. I have nothing left. Please. Just $50. I'll pay you back somehow. Please don't ignore your daughter." Her thumb shook as it hovered over the send button. She closed her eyes, whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore, and pressed send. The message whooshed into the digital void. She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. What had she become? A 30-year-old woman begging her ex-husband for baby formula money at 3 in the morning. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd held that positive pregnancy test 2 years ago, tears of joy streaming down her face. Her phone buzzed. Her heart stopped. That was fast. Too fast. Nelson usually made her wait, made her suffer. She grabbed the phone with trembling hands. Here is the exchange between Lillian and the stranger. Unknown number responds, "I think you have the wrong number, but I just read your message. How much do you need? I'd like to help." Lillian stared at the screen, her mind refusing to process the words. Wrong number? She scrolled up, checked the contact. Her stomach dropped. The last digit, it was a 7, not a 4. In her exhaustion, in her desperation, she'd mistyped Nelson's number. She just begged a complete stranger for money. Lillian's text reads, "Oh my God. I'm so sorry. Please ignore that. I'm mortified. Wrong number." The 3 dots appeared immediately. This stranger was still typing. Unknown number texts. "Don't be sorry. How much does baby formula cost? And how much do you need to get through the month?" Lillian's hands began to shake harder. Who was this person? Lillian texted back saying, "I can't accept money from a stranger. Thank you for being kind, but please forget you saw this." The unknown number responds, "I'm going to send you $500. Use it for formula, diapers, whatever your daughter needs. No strings attached. Sometimes we all need help. Let me be that help tonight." Before Lillian could respond, before she could protest, before she could even breathe, her phone buzzed with a Venmo notification. $500 from Jackson Pierce. She read the name through blurring tears. Jackson Pierce. She didn't know a Jackson Pierce. She'd never heard that name in her life. But in 60 seconds, this stranger had done more for her daughter than her own husband had in 3 months. What Lillian didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she sat in that dark apartment clutching her phone like a lifeline, was that this mistake wasn't a mistake at all. It was the beginning of a truth so impossible, so unbelievable, that it would shatter everything she thought she knew about her daughter's existence. And the man on the other end of that text, sitting in his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, staring at the message from a desperate mother, felt something he hadn't felt in years. A pull. A connection. A strange, Inexplicable, knowing that his life had just changed forever. He just didn't know that in helping a stranger's baby, he was actually saving his own daughter. Welcome back, my lovely family, to another incredibly heartwarming story. I trust everyone is doing great. If you're new, please hit the subscribe button now, so you don't get to miss the next story. Also remember to hit the notification icon bell, so you don't miss the remaining part of this highly emotional and intriguing story. To understand how Lillian found herself at rock bottom at 2:47 a.m., begging a stranger for help, you have to go back. Back to when her world still made sense. Back to when she believed in fairy tales and forever. 2 years earlier, Lillian had been a different woman. She worked as a dental assistant in downtown Chicago, lived in a modest but comfortable one-bedroom apartment, and had just married the love of her life, Nelson Crawford. He was a pharmaceutical sales representative, charming, ambitious, always talking about the future they'd build together. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Or so she thought. When Lillian discovered she was pregnant 6 months into their marriage, she'd expected Nelson to be overjoyed. They'd talked about children. They'd planned for children. But when she showed him that positive test, something shifted in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was something darker. Something like fear. He smiled. He said the right things. But his eyes told a different story. The pregnancy was difficult. Morning sickness that lasted all day. Fatigue that felt like drowning. Lillian had to reduce her hours at work, and Nelson picked up extra shifts to compensate. At least that's what he said he was doing. The truth was, he was disappearing. Coming home later and later. Speaking less and less. Creating distance that Lillian couldn't understand. She blamed herself. Maybe she complained too much about the pregnancy symptoms. Maybe she wasn't attractive anymore with her swollen belly and constant exhaustion. Maybe he was scared of becoming a father. She made excuses for him because the alternative, that he simply didn't want this baby, was too painful to consider. Layla was born on a frigid January morning, weighing 6 pounds, 3 ounces. She had her mother's deep brown eyes and a head full of dark curls that the nurses said was unusual for a newborn. Lillian fell in love instantly, completely, irrevocably. This tiny human was her entire world now. Nelson held his daughter for exactly 4 minutes in the hospital. Lillian timed it, though she didn't mean to. She watched him stare at Layla with an expression she couldn't read. Not love. Not joy. Something closer to confusion. To suspicion. When the nurse asked if he wanted to do skin-to-skin contact, he handed the baby back to Lillian and said he needed to make some work calls. The first month was survival. Sleepless nights. Endless feedings. A colicky baby who seemed to cry more than she slept. Lillian was drowning, and Nelson was a ghost in their apartment. Present but absent. There but not there. In the second month, he started sleeping on the couch. Said the baby's crying kept him awake and he needed rest for work. Lillian was too exhausted to fight. Too overwhelmed to see the pattern forming. In the third month, she woke up one morning to find him gone. Not just gone to work. Gone. His clothes cleared out. His toiletries removed from the bathroom. Half their meager savings account emptied. And a note on the kitchen counter that said only, "I can't do this. Don't try to find me." No explanation. No apology. No forwarding address. Just gone. Lillian called his phone for 3 days straight. Voicemail. She called his job. They said he'd resigned. She called his mother. The woman, cold as ice, said her son had his reasons and Lillian should leave him alone. His reasons. What reasons? What could possibly justify abandoning your 3-month-old daughter? The questions consumed her, but survival demanded her attention. Single motherhood wasn't something she'd prepared for. The apartment rent was $1,200 a month. Daycare was $800. Formula, diapers, doctor visits, another $400. Her dental assistant salary, reduced to part-time because she couldn't afford full-time daycare, brought in $1,800 a month after taxes. Do the math. It doesn't work. She picked up a second job waitressing at a diner 3 nights a week. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow who lived alone, offered to watch Layla those nights for $50 a week instead of the $30 an hour a proper babysitter would charge. It was charity disguised as business, but Lillian was too desperate to refuse. For 5 months, she juggled it all. Barely. The bank account hovered between $20 and $100. She bought the cheapest formula, reused diapers when she could, wore the same 3 outfits over and over, stopped eating lunch to save money, watched her body shrink and her face hollow. The eviction notice came in month 8. She was 3 months behind on rent. The landlord, who'd been patient, had run out of patience. She had 30 days. She applied for public housing. The waiting list was 18 months. She applied for additional food assistance. Denied because she made $43 too much per month to qualify. She looked into moving back home to Mississippi where her mother lived, but her mother's 2-bedroom apartment was already housing her mother and her disabled brother. There was no room. The walls were closing in. Then came the day everything collapsed. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably cold for September. She'd just finished her dental assistant shift when her manager called her into the office. Budget cuts. Last hired, first fired. She'd have 2 weeks of work left. Then unemployment. The unemployment would be $240 a week. That wasn't enough to cover even half her expenses. She sat in her car in the parking lot and couldn't breathe. Panic attack. First one of her life. Her chest felt like it was caving in. Her vision tunneled. She genuinely thought she was dying. But she didn't die. She just sat there until the panic passed, until she could breathe again, until she could drive home to her baby. That night, she worked her waitressing shift. She smiled at customers, refilled coffee, pretended her world wasn't ending. Then at 11 p.m., her manager pulled her aside. Someone had complained about her attitude, said she seemed distracted and unfriendly. The manager was sorry, but they needed to let her go. Effective immediately. 2 jobs lost in 1 day. Lillian drove home in a daze. Mrs. Chen handed her a sleeping Layla and whispered that she looked terrible, that she should rest. Rest. What a luxury. What a joke. She checked the formula container. Less than 3 scoops left. Maybe enough for 1 more bottle. Layla would need a bottle in about 4 hours, around 3 a.m. Then what? She checked her bank account. $4.23. She checked her credit cards. All maxed out. She checked her phone for messages from anyone who might help. Nothing. That's when she thought of Nelson. She'd sworn she wouldn't contact him. Wouldn't beg. But that was before she'd lost everything in a single day. That was before she'd run out of formula with a hungry baby and empty pockets. Pride is easy when you have options. When you have none, pride becomes a luxury you simply cannot afford. You know what's interesting about hitting rock bottom? Sometimes you think you've hit it, but then the floor gives way again and you discover there's always further to fall. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually launching pads for something we could never imagine. Sometimes, what feels like the end is actually a beginning dressed in tragedy's clothing. And if you're watching this story unfold right now, wondering how it ends, Wondering if Lillian ever finds her way out of this darkness? Well, maybe you should subscribe to this channel, because the journey we're about to take together, it's going to challenge everything you think you know about mistakes and miracles. So there Lillian sat in her dark apartment, with her sleeping baby and her shattered pride, typing out a message to the man who'd abandoned them both. She typed his number from memory. She'd deleted his contact months ago, but the numbers were burned into her brain. 10 digits that once meant love and safety and future. Except in her exhaustion, in her desperation, in her tear-blurred vision, she typed one number wrong. She typed a 7 instead of a 4. 10 digits. One mistake. And somewhere across the city, in a world she couldn't imagine, a phone lit up on a mahogany desk in a corner office on the 47th floor. A man she'd never met, living a life she'd never know, read her message and felt something shift in his chest. 2 strangers connected by a typo. A wrong number that would turn out to be the most right thing that ever happened. Jackson Pierce didn't need an alarm clock. He woke every morning at 5:30 a.m. sharp, a habit formed over 20 years of building his empire from nothing. At 42, he was the founder and CEO of Pierce Technologies, a cloud computing company that had made him a billionaire 3 times over. Forbes estimated his net worth at $3.7 billion. His penthouse apartment overlooked Lake Michigan. His car collection included vehicles most people only saw in movies. He had homes in 5 countries. He had everything money could buy, and nothing that money couldn't. That particular Tuesday, the day Lillian's world collapsed, Jackson had been in back-to-back board meetings since 7 a.m. Quarterly earnings, expansion plans, merger negotiations, the kind of high-stakes discussions where millions of dollars shifted based on single decisions. He was good at it. Brilliant, actually. Cold, calculating, strategic. He'd built his company by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his competition. But lately, the victories felt hollow. His first marriage had ended 8 years ago. Miranda had been beautiful, sophisticated, from the right family. They'd married when he was building the company, when he was still hungry and ambitious and had something to prove. She'd wanted the lifestyle his success would bring. He'd wanted a partner for the journey. Turned out, they'd both been wrong about what they wanted. The marriage lasted 5 years. No children, though they'd tried. Test after test revealed nothing wrong with either of them. Just incompatible somehow. The doctors called it unexplained infertility. Jackson called it a sign. They divorced amicably, split assets fairly, and never spoke again. His second marriage lasted 3 years. Catherine had been different from Miranda. Warmer, more genuine, or so he thought. She'd pursued him relentlessly at a charity gala, and he'd been flattered. Lonely. Ready to try again. They married quickly, too quickly. She wanted children immediately. He wanted to make her happy. They tried everything, fertility treatments, IVF, multiple rounds of hormone injections that turned his wife into someone he didn't recognize. It broke something in her. In them. She blamed him, even though the doctors said it wasn't anyone's fault. She became bitter, resentful. Accused him of being married to his work instead of to her. She was right, of course. When your home becomes a battlefield, you find reasons to stay at the office. They divorced 2 years ago. Catherine got $50 million in the settlement and a house in Malibu. Jackson got his freedom and a deeper loneliness than he'd ever known. He'd tried dating after that. Supermodels. Actresses. Brilliant entrepreneurs. Every woman who was interested in Jackson Pierce. Billionaire. Not a single one who wanted to know Jackson Pierce, the man. The one who'd grown up in a trailer park in Indiana. The one whose mother worked 3 jobs to keep him fed. The one who coded his first program on a library computer because they couldn't afford one at home. The one who still felt like an imposter at fancy galas and charity dinners. That Jackson Pierce was buried so deep, sometimes he forgot he existed. At 2:49 a.m. that Wednesday morning, Jackson wasn't sleeping. He was in his home office, reviewing contracts for a potential acquisition. Sleep was hard these days. The penthouse was too quiet, too big, too empty. Success, he'd learned, had a particular kind of silence, the kind that echoed. His phone, face down on the desk, buzzed. He almost ignored it. Late-night messages were usually from his assistant about morning schedule changes or from board members in different time zones. Nothing urgent. Nothing that mattered. But something made him pick it up. The message from the unknown number appeared on his screen, and Jackson read it once. Then twice. Then a third time. A woman named Lillian. A baby named Layla. A desperate plea for $50. An ex-husband who'd abandoned them. A second job lost. Nothing left. Jackson Pierce, who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, who'd fired hundreds of employees without losing sleep, who'd ruthlessly crushed competitors without remorse, felt his chest tighten. He saw his mother in those words. His mother, who'd raised him alone after his father disappeared. His mother, who'd chosen between groceries and electricity more times than he could count. His mother, who'd cried in the bathroom when she thought he couldn't hear, trying to figure out how to keep them afloat. He'd been 8 years old, standing outside that bathroom door, listening to her muffled sobs, and he'd made a promise to himself. Someday, he'd have enough money that she'd never cry about bills again. Someday, he'd make sure she never felt that desperate. He'd kept that promise. His mother lived in a beautiful house in Florida now, every need met, every want satisfied. But he couldn't go back in time and save her from those years of desperation. He couldn't erase her tears. Maybe he couldn't save his mother's past. But he could save this stranger's present. The response came from somewhere deep, somewhere he didn't fully understand. He typed quickly before logic could interfere. Before the cold, calculating billionaire could override the 8-year-old boy who'd listened to his mother cry. When Lillian protested, when she said she couldn't accept money from a stranger, something fierce rose in him. Why not? Who decided that only people you knew deserved help? Who made that rule? He sent the $500. More than she'd asked for. Less than he spent on a single dinner at his favorite restaurant. Then he stared at her name in his phone. Lillian. He didn't know her last name. Didn't know where she lived. Didn't know anything about her except that she was drowning and reaching for anything to keep her head above water. He should have left it there. Good deed done. Karma balanced. Move on. But he couldn't. Over the next 3 days, he checked his phone obsessively, waiting for a thank you message. A confirmation that she'd received the money. Something. When her message finally came, a simple, heartfelt thank you that acknowledged it was too much but that she'd pay him back somehow, he felt something warm spread through his chest. He told her not to worry about paying it back. She insisted she would someday. They went back and forth, and somewhere in that exchange a connection formed. Fragile. Unexpected. Strange. He asked how she was doing. She answered cautiously at first, then more openly. He asked about Layla. Lillian sent a photo, just one, of a beautiful baby girl with curls and deep eyes and a smile that punched him in the gut. Something about that baby's face. He couldn't explain it. Jackson Pierce didn't believe in fate. He believed in strategy, in planning, in controlling outcomes. But staring at that photo of a baby he'd never met, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. A week after the first $500, Lillian mentioned she'd found a new job but wouldn't get her first paycheck for 2 weeks. Jackson sent another $800 without being asked. When she protested, he told her to consider it a loan if it made her feel better, knowing he'd never ask for a penny back. 2 weeks later, she mentioned her car had broken down. The repair was $600. Jackson sent $1,000 for the repair and whatever else she needed. He couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. Every time he helped her, every time he made her life a little easier, he felt that warmth again. That purpose. That feeling of mattering to someone who had no agenda, no ulterior motive, no knowledge of who he really was. To Lillian, he was just Jackson, a kind stranger who'd appeared in her darkest hour. She didn't know about the billions or the penthouse or the business empire. He was careful never to reveal too much. He gave her a Google Voice number instead of his real one. Paid through Venmo with an account that didn't connect to his business. Kept his world separate from hers. Why? He asked himself that question every day. Why the secrecy? Why the distance? Why not just tell her the truth, that he was a billionaire who could solve all her problems with one phone call to his accountant? Because he liked who he was to her. Just Jackson. Just a guy who'd received a wrong number text and decided to help. Not Jackson Pierce, billionaire. Not Jackson Pierce, CEO. Not Jackson Pierce, two-time divorcee who couldn't give his wives the one thing they'd wanted. Just Jackson. It was refreshing. Intoxicating. Real in a way nothing in his life had been real for years. His assistant noticed his distraction in meetings. His board members commented that he seemed softer somehow. His therapist, in their weekly sessions, noted that he smiled more when talking about something, he wouldn't say what. It was Lillian. And Layla. The woman and baby he'd never met but thought about constantly. He found himself wondering what they were doing. If Layla was sleeping through the night yet. If Lillian had eaten that day. If they were warm enough. Safe enough. Happy enough. 3 months after that first text, Jackson suggested they talk on the phone instead of just texting. Voice only, he specified. He wasn't ready for video. Wasn't ready for her to see his face and potentially recognize him from magazine covers or news articles. Wasn't ready to shatter the bubble they'd created. Her voice was softer than he'd imagined. Tired. But there was strength underneath. The kind of strength that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. They talked for 2 hours that first night. About everything and nothing. Her childhood in Mississippi. His in Indiana. Her dreams of going back to school someday. His memories of building his first computer from spare parts at age 12. He was careful. Never mentioned specifics about his company. Never mentioned money beyond what he sent her. Let her believe he was comfortable but not wealthy. Successful but not extraordinary. And somewhere in those late-night conversations, something shifted. It wasn't just charity anymore. It wasn't just helping a stranger. It was connection. Real connection. The kind he hadn't felt with either of his wives. The kind that made him check his phone every 10 minutes hoping for a message. The kind that made him lie awake thinking about a woman he'd never met and a baby he'd seen only in photos. His therapist asked him what he was really doing. Was he trying to save them or save himself? Jackson didn't have an answer. All he knew was that for the first time in years, maybe decades, he felt like his life meant something beyond profit margins and stock prices. He felt needed. Not for his money, because Lillian didn't know about the billions. Not for his status, because she didn't know who he was. Just needed as a human being who'd shown up when no one else would. It was the purest thing he'd ever experienced. And he was terrified of losing it. What Jackson didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he sent those payments and answered those late-night calls, was that his connection to Lillian and Layla went deeper than kindness or coincidence. Somewhere in a filing cabinet in a fertility clinic across town, there was a piece of paper with 2 names on it. A piece of paper that represented a mistake, a mix-up, an error that had happened 2 years ago and had never been caught. An error that meant the baby whose photo he stared at every night, the baby who'd captured his heart through a screen, wasn't just a stranger's child he was helping. She was his daughter. And the universe, in its mysterious way, had led him to her through what looked like pure chance but was actually the most deliberate thing that had ever happened. Sometimes the people we're meant to find don't come through the front door. Sometimes they come through a wrong number at 2:47 in the morning. Sometimes the family you're searching for finds you first, disguised as a stranger in need. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beauty of life, the way it conspires to give us what we need when we've stopped looking for it. If that resonates with you, if you've ever felt like the universe was trying to tell you something, drop your location in the comments and let me know where you're watching from, because this story, it's about to get even more unbelievable. Winter arrived in Chicago with a vengeance. The kind of cold that bites through coats and settles in your bones. But for Lillian, this winter felt different from the last. This winter, her heat stayed on. Her refrigerator had food. Layla had formula, diapers, and even some new clothes that actually fit. All because of Jackson. 4 months had passed since that desperate 2:47 a.m. text. 4 months of regular messages, phone calls that stretched into the early morning hours, and financial support that had transformed Lillian's life from survival mode to something close to stable. She'd stopped protesting his help. Stopped insisting she'd pay him back. He wouldn't let her, and honestly, she didn't know how she would anyway. The debt had grown to over $7,000, an impossible sum for someone making $15 an hour at her new job as a receptionist at a pediatric office. The job itself was a gift, found through a connection Jackson had made. He'd mentioned he knew someone who knew someone looking for office help. It wasn't charity, he'd insisted. She'd still had to interview. Still had to prove herself. But the opportunity had come from him, and Lillian knew it. Her apartment was still small, still in a rough neighborhood, but the eviction notice was gone. She'd caught up on rent. Caught up on everything, really. For the first time in a year, she wasn't living in constant panic about which bill to pay first. But the money wasn't what kept her awake at night anymore. It was Jackson. She thought about him constantly. During her lunch breaks, she'd reread their text conversations. During Layla's nap times, she'd stare at her phone hoping for a message. During long nights when sleep wouldn't come, she'd replay their phone conversations, analyzing every word, every pause, every laugh. She was falling for a man she'd never met. A man whose face she'd never seen. A man who could be anyone, anywhere, anything. It was absurd. Dangerous, even. But her heart didn't care about logic. He was kind in a way that felt genuine, not performative. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answer. He remembered small details, like how she'd mentioned her favorite color was purple and then sent Layla a purple blanket the next week. He made her laugh with dry humor and surprising vulnerability. He shared pieces of his past, his lonely childhood, his complicated relationship with success, his failed marriages. That last part had surprised her. He'd been married twice. Both had ended badly. Both wives had wanted children. He'd been unable to give them that, and the failure had eaten away at both relationships until there was nothing left but resentment and lawyers. Lillian's heart had ached for him when he'd shared that. The pain in his voice was raw, real. He'd wanted to be a father. Had tried everything. Had felt like a failure when it didn't happen. And now he was 42, divorced twice, and convinced that ship had sailed. She'd wanted to tell him that he'd be an amazing father. That his kindness toward Layla, whom he'd never even met, proved that. But it felt too intimate, too presumptuous. So she just listened, let him talk, and wished she could reach through the phone and hug him. Their conversations had evolved from surface level to deeply personal. He told her about board meetings that bored him to tears, about feeling like an imposter in wealthy circles despite having more money than most of them, about missing his mother who'd passed away 5 years ago and never got to see him at his most successful. He told her about the loneliness of big empty spaces and perfect silence. She told him about growing up poor in Mississippi, about a father who drank too much and a mother who loved too little, about escaping to Chicago at 18 with nothing but a GED and determination. She told him about meeting Nelson at a hospital where she was working as a unit clerk and he was delivering pharmaceutical samples. About how charming he'd been, how he'd made her believe in love at first sight. About the pregnancy and his sudden coldness. About the abandonment and the questions that haunted her. Why did he leave? Why did he look at Layla like she was a stranger? Why did he empty their account and disappear without explanation? Jackson had no answers, but he listened. He was always there at the other end of a text or call, constant in a way no one else in her life had ever been. In their 5th month of communication, during a particularly long phone call at 1 a.m., Jackson asked a question that changed everything. How exactly had Layla been conceived? It seemed random, out of nowhere. Lillian had been talking about Layla's new tooth when he'd interrupted with the question. She'd laughed, confused. The normal way she'd answered. Why? He'd paused. Too long. Then said, just curious. But Lillian knew there was more to it. She pressed him. Why are you asking? What aren't you saying? Another long pause. Then, slowly, carefully, Jackson had asked if they'd had any trouble conceiving, if they'd needed any medical help. And that's when Lillian's memory flickered to something she'd almost forgotten. Something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now, under Jackson's gentle questioning, felt suddenly important. They had needed help. Not much, but some. Nelson had suggested they go to a fertility clinic, said it would speed things along since they both wanted a baby. She'd been surprised. They'd only been trying for 3 months, but he'd insisted. Said his insurance covered it. Said there was no harm in making sure everything was working right. They'd gone to the Midwest Fertility Center downtown. Had some tests done. She remembered being embarrassed, clinical, uncomfortable with strangers involved in something so intimate. The doctor had said everything looked fine with her. Nelson had gone in for his test privately, and she'd never actually seen the results. The doctor had just said they'd do an IUI, intrauterine insemination, to maximize chances. It had worked on the first try. She'd been thrilled. Nelson had been strange. Not happy exactly. More like stressed. She'd attributed it to new father nerves. Now, telling Jackson this story, she heard the words differently. Heard the strangeness in Nelson's behavior. Heard the urgency that didn't make sense. Jackson had gone very quiet on the other end of the line. What clinic, he'd asked. What was the name? Midwest Fertility Center. Why? Another long silence. Then, Lillian, I need to tell you something. I need to ask you something. And it's going to sound crazy. But I need you to trust me. Her heart had started pounding. Okay. I used that same clinic. 2 years ago. With my second wife. We went through IVF. Multiple rounds. It never worked, but I left samples there. For future attempts that never happened. Lillian's blood had gone cold. What are you saying? I'm saying the timing matches. I'm saying we were at the same clinic at the same time. I'm saying, God, I'm saying this sounds insane. But what if there was a mistake? No. No, that's impossible. That doesn't happen. They have protocols, systems, checks. They do. But they're human. And humans make mistakes. Lillian. Has Layla ever been tested? Paternity tested? Why would she be? Nelson was her father. Was he? Think about it. Really think about it. Why did he insist on the clinic? Why did he leave right after she was born? Why did he look at her like she was a stranger? Because Lillian's voice had cracked. Because he's a terrible person. Because he's a deadbeat. Because he found out something he couldn't handle. Something that made him run. The conversation had spiraled from there. Theories. Possibilities. Impossibilities. Jackson had been calm, logical, gentle. Lillian had been anything but. She'd cried. Argued. Insisted he was wrong. Insisted this was crazy. Insisted she didn't want to hear it. But the seed was planted. Over the next 2 weeks it grew. She found herself staring at Layla, really looking at her. The baby didn't look like Nelson, she'd always known that. She didn't really look like Lillian either, except for the eyes. But there were features she couldn't place. The shape of her nose. The curve of her chin. The way she smiled, lopsided and charming. She tried to push it away. Tried to focus on work, on daily life, on anything but the growing suspicion that Jackson might be right. Then Nelson's mother called. It was the first time they'd spoken since Nelson left. The woman was brief, cold, efficient. Said that Nelson had asked her to deliver a message. That he was sorry. That he couldn't be a father to Layla because, and this is where the older woman's voice had wavered, because she wasn't his. He'd found out at the clinic. The numbers didn't match. His sperm count was too low. Had always been too low. The clinic had used someone else's sample. He couldn't handle it. Couldn't look at a child that wasn't his. So he left. Lillian had stood in her kitchen. Phone pressed to her ear, world tilting. Couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. Nelson's mother had continued. Said her son was weak. Said he should have handled it differently. But said that Lillian needed to know the truth. That Layla wasn't Nelson's biological daughter. That there had been a mistake at the clinic. That someone else's sperm had been used. Someone else. After she hung up, Lillian had sunk to the floor and sobbed. Not because she missed Nelson. Not because she wanted him back. But because her daughter's entire origin story had just shifted. Because nothing was what she thought it was. Because somewhere out there, a stranger was Layla's biological father and had no idea she existed. She'd called Jackson immediately. Told him everything through tears. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, I think we need to meet. In person. I think we need to know the truth. And Lillian, terrified and desperate and completely overwhelmed, had agreed. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our lives are just that, stories. Comfortable narratives that make sense of chaos. But what happens when the narrative shatters? What happens when the truth you've built your world on turns out to be fiction? These are the moments that define us. Not the easy times, but the moments when everything we believed gets questioned. If you're still watching, if you're invested in where this goes, consider subscribing because the truth Lillian and Jackson are about to uncover, it will change everything. And maybe drop a comment about whether you believe in fate or coincidence, because this story, it might change your answer. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, neutral territory, public but not crowded. Jackson suggested a Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Lillian had agreed, her hands shaking as she typed the response. She'd spent the entire week before the meeting in a state of near panic. What would she wear? How would she explain this to Layla if the baby cried during the meeting? What if Jackson turned out to be completely different from the person she'd built up in her mind? What if he took one look at her and was disappointed? What if the DNA test they were planning to do came back positive and her daughter belonged to this man she barely knew? That last question kept her up at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had become a plot too strange for fiction. Saturday arrived with gray skies and temperatures in the 20s. Lillian bundled Layla in layers, pink snowsuit and matching hat, and took 2 buses to Lincoln Park because her car was acting up again and she didn't want to risk it breaking down and making her late. She arrived 15 minutes early and sat in a corner booth, Layla in her carrier beside her. The baby was surprisingly calm, big eyes taking in the new environment. Lillian's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She ordered a coffee she didn't drink, just to have something to do. At exactly 10 a.m., the cafe door opened, and Jackson Pierce walked in. Lillian recognized him instantly, though she'd never seen his face. Something about the way he carried himself, the way his eyes scanned the room and landed on her with recognition, with warmth, with something that made her chest tight. He was tall, over 6 feet. Caucasian, with graying hair at the temples and blue-gray eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore dark jeans and a simple sweater under an expensive-looking wool coat. He was handsome, dignified, but it was his smile that caught her. Gentle, nervous, real. He walked to her table and stopped, and for a moment they just stared at each other. 5 months of phone calls and texts and late-night conversations, and now here he was, in 3 dimensions, real and solid and right in front of her. "Lillian," he said quietly. His voice, so familiar from their calls, sounded different in person. Warmer. "Jackson," she whispered back. He gestured to the seat across from her. "May I?" She nodded, unable to form words. He sat down, and his eyes immediately went to Layla in the carrier. "And this is Layla." Lillian watched his face as he looked at her daughter. Watched something shift in his expression. Something powerful. Something that looked almost like recognition. His hand reached out, hovering over the carrier, then pulled back. "May I?" Lillian nodded again, her throat tight. Jackson gently unbuckled the carrier straps and lifted Layla out with surprising confidence. He held her carefully, securely, like he'd done this before. Layla stared up at him with her big brown eyes, and Jackson stared back, and Lillian watched something happen that she couldn't explain. It was like they knew each other. "She's beautiful," Jackson said, his voice thick. She looks like." He stopped himself, looked at Lillian. "I'm sorry. This is overwhelming. Tell me about it," Lillian managed. She was studying his face, comparing it to Layla's. The nose, the chin, the shape of the eyes, even though the color was different. Was she imagining the similarities? Seeing what she expected to see? They talked for 2 hours. About everything and nothing. About how strange it was to finally meet after months of virtual connection. About Layla and her milestones. About work and life and the weather. Small talk that felt monumental because of the weight beneath it. Jackson held Layla almost the entire time. Bounced her when she fussed. Made her laugh with silly faces. Fed her a bottle when Lillian offered it. And through it all, Lillian saw something in his face that broke her heart. Longing. Pure, undisguised longing. This man wanted to be a father so badly. Had wanted it for years. Had tried everything. Had failed with 2 wives. And now he held her daughter with such tenderness, such natural ease, that Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. Before they left, Jackson brought up the DNA test. He'd done research. Found a reputable lab. They could do a simple cheek swab, send it in, have results in 2 weeks. Would she be willing? Lillian looked at her daughter in his arms. Looked at his face. Looked at the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. "Yes," she said. "I need to know. We all need to know." They did the test right there in the cafe. 2 simple swabs. One from Layla's cheek. One from Jackson's. Sealed in individual bags. Labeled. Ready to be sent. Jackson walked them to the bus stop. Insisted on calling them a car service instead. Lillian protested, but he'd already pulled out his phone and ordered it. When the car arrived, he opened the door for her, helped her settle Layla in the car seat. Before she got in, he touched her arm gently. "Lillian, whatever the test says, I want you to know something. Meeting Layla, it's been the best thing that's happened to me in years. Maybe ever. No matter what, I'm here. For both of you. Okay." She'd nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The 2 weeks waiting for test results were the longest of Lillian's life. Jackson called every day. They met twice more, once at a park where he pushed Layla on the baby swings, once at an indoor play center where he sat on the floor and let Layla climb on him while Lillian watched with an aching heart. He was so good with her. So natural. So fatherly. And Layla responded to him in a way she'd never responded to anyone else, even Lillian. She lit up when she saw him, reached for him, laid her head on his shoulder and fell asleep within minutes. It was like they were connected, like they recognized each other on some level that transcended logic. During their second meeting at the play center, Lillian asked Jackson something that had been bothering her. "Why didn't you tell me who you really are?" He'd looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I Googled you," she admitted. "Jackson Pierce. Pierce Technologies. You're not just successful. You're a billionaire. You own half the cloud computing market. You're on Forbes lists. You have homes around the world. Why didn't you tell me?" He'd been quiet for a long moment, watching Layla play with blocks. "Because that's not who I wanted to be with you. I wanted to be just Jackson. Just a guy who got a wrong number text and decided to help. Not Jackson Pierce, CEO. Not Jackson Pierce, billionaire. Just me. The person underneath all the money and success and empty houses." "But you lied," she said softly. "By omission." "I did," he agreed. "And I'm sorry. But Lillian, if I'd told you the truth, would you have let me help? Would you have accepted the money? Would you have talked to me like you have?" She'd thought about it. "Probably not." "Exactly. You would have seen me as some rich guy with a savior complex. As someone to be suspicious of. As someone trying to buy his way into your life. But I'm not. I wanted to know you. Really know you. And I wanted you to know me. The real me. Not the Forbes version." She'd understood. But it still stung, the deception, even if she understood the motivation. He'd reached across the play mat and taken her hand. "I'm sorry. Truly. From now on, complete honesty. I promise." And she'd believed him. 3 days before the test results were due, Jackson made a proposal. He wanted to offer her a job at Pierce Technologies. Better pay, better benefits, a position in HR that would use her organizational skills. She could bring Layla to the office. They had a daycare on site. She could start building a real career, not just working to survive. Lillian's first instinct was to refuse. It felt like charity, like he was trying to fix her life with money. But he'd anticipated her objection. "This isn't about the test," he'd said. "This isn't about what we might find out. This is about the fact that you're smart and capable and deserve better than $15 an hour answering phones. I've seen how you organize things, how you problem solve, how you interact with people. You'd be good at this. And yes, I can make it happen because I own the company, but that doesn't make it charity. You'd still have to do the work. You'd still have to prove yourself. I'm just opening a door." She'd wanted to say no. wanted to maintain her independence. But she was tired of struggling, tired of barely making it, tired of pride that kept her from opportunities. She'd said yes. By the time the test results arrived, Lillian had been working at Pierce Technologies for a week, had her own small office, had Layla in the company daycare where the staff was professional and caring and the facility was nicer than anywhere Lillian could have afforded on her own, had a salary that was triple what she'd been making, had health insurance that actually covered things, had a life that felt stable, secure, possible. And she knew that if the test came back positive, everything would change again. But maybe not in a bad way. Maybe, for the first time in her life, things would change for the better. The email from the lab came on a Thursday afternoon. Subject line: DNA test results. Case number 47839. Jackson called her immediately. He'd gotten the same email. Neither of them had opened it yet. Together? He asked. Together, she agreed. They met in his office on the 47th floor. Corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He'd never brought her here before, kept their meetings casual and public. But this felt too important, too private. She sat across from his desk, laptop open. He sat beside her, his laptop open too. Both emails displayed, both unopened. He took her hand. Whatever it says, we handle it together. Okay. Okay, she whispered. On three. On three. He counted. 1, 2, 3. They clicked. And the truth, the impossible, unbelievable, world-shattering truth, appeared on both screens simultaneously. Life has a way of preparing us for moments we don't see coming. Little signs along the way, breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable destination. Sometimes we notice them. Sometimes we don't. But looking back, they're always there. The connection that felt too strong too fast. The recognition that defied logic. The pull toward a stranger that didn't make sense. These aren't coincidences. They're whispers of a truth too big to see until it's right in front of you. And what Lillian and Jackson were about to read, what the science was about to confirm, it was something their hearts had already known. The words on the screen blurred through Lillian's tears. Probability of paternity: 99.9%. Jackson Pierce is not excluded as the biological father. The analysis indicates that Jackson Pierce is the biological father of Layla Crawford. She couldn't breathe. The office spun. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair as the truth crashed over her in waves. Jackson Pierce, the stranger who'd received her desperate text 6 months ago, was Layla's biological father. The man who'd saved them, supported them, cared for them from a distance, was connected to them by blood. By biology. By a mistake made 2 years ago in a fertility clinic that had just rewritten 3 lives. She looked at Jackson. He was frozen, staring at the screen with an expression she couldn't read. Shock. Disbelief. Something deeper. Something that looked like grief and joy colliding. "I have a daughter," he whispered. The words seemed to break something in him. His face crumpled. His shoulders shook. And Jackson Pierce, billionaire CEO, ruthless businessman, started crying in a way that sounded like a lifetime of longing finally released. Lillian found herself moving without thinking. She crossed to his chair, put her arms around him, and they held each other while the magnitude settled over them. She was crying too, but she didn't know if it was from shock or relief or fear or something else entirely. "All those years," he said into her shoulder. "All those attempts with my wives. All that failure. And she was here the whole time. My daughter was in the world and I didn't know. I didn't know. How is this possible?" Lillian pulled back, wiping her eyes. "How does a clinic make this kind of mistake?" "I don't know." But we're going to find out. The investigation Jackson launched over the next 3 weeks was thorough, exhaustive, and expensive. He hired the best medical malpractice attorneys in the state, hired private investigators to dig into Midwest Fertility Center's history, hired experts to review the clinic's protocols and procedures. Money was no object. He wanted answers. What they uncovered was a story of negligence, understaffing, and systematic failure. Midwest Fertility Center had been struggling financially 2 years ago. To cut costs, they'd reduced staff. Lab technicians were overworked, handling twice the normal patient load. Protocols that required 2-person verification of specimens were being done by single technicians. Labeling systems that should have been triple-checked were rushed. Storage systems that should have been organized by strict protocols had become chaotic. On the specific day that Lillian and Nelson had come in for their IUI procedure, the clinic had been particularly understaffed. The technician handling the sperm samples had been new, inadequately trained, and managing 5 couple specimens simultaneously. Jackson's sperm sample, deposited 2 weeks earlier for his second wife's IVF cycle, had been stored in the same refrigeration unit. The labeling was similar. Nelson Crawford, Jackson Pierce. Both had been scheduled for procedures that week. Both samples were in the prep area at the same time. The new technician, overwhelmed and rushing, had grabbed the wrong vial. It was that simple. That devastating. That life-altering. One grab. One mistake. One moment of inattention, and Layla had been conceived with Jackson's sperm instead of Nelson's. Nelson had never been told directly, but he'd suspected something was wrong. After Layla's birth, when he'd looked at his daughter and seen nothing of himself, he'd gone back to the clinic privately, demanded his records, discovered his sperm count was nearly 0. Had always been nearly 0. The clinic had noted it in his file but had never explicitly told him that conception without intervention was virtually impossible. He'd done the math. If his sperm couldn't conceive, and Lillian had gotten pregnant, then the clinic had used someone else's sample. Whether by accident or design, his wife had given birth to another man's child. That's why he'd run. Not because he was cruel, though his method of leaving certainly was, but because he couldn't handle the truth. Couldn't look at Layla and not see the evidence of his inadequacy. Couldn't be a father to a child that wasn't genetically his. It was cowardice dressed up as self-preservation. The clinic, when confronted with evidence of their mistake, initially denied everything. Then, faced with irrefutable DNA proof and the threat of a massive lawsuit, they admitted to the error, offered a settlement, begged Jackson not to go public because it would destroy them. He'd wanted to destroy them, wanted to sue them into oblivion, wanted the world to know what they'd done. But his lawyers advised caution. A public lawsuit would expose Layla's origin story to media scrutiny, would make her childhood a spectacle, would define her identity by this mistake for the rest of her life. Did he really want that for his daughter? Lillian had been the one to make the final decision. She'd listened to the lawyer's advice, listened to Jackson's rage, and said simply, "I want to protect Layla. Whatever does that best, that's what we do." They settled privately. The clinic paid an undisclosed amount, multiple millions that would go into a trust for Layla. They agreed to review all their protocols, hire more staff, and implement new verification systems. They agreed to notify any other patients who might have been affected by similar errors during that time period. And they agreed to close their doors within 6 months, allowing current patients to transfer care elsewhere but taking no new clients. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Throughout the investigation, Jackson's relationship with Lillian and Layla had deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. He was at their apartment every day after work. He did bath time and bedtime. He changed diapers and warmed bottles and read board books with funny voices that made Layla giggle. He was, for all practical purposes, Layla's father. Active, present, devoted. But the legal reality was complicated. Lillian was Layla's biological mother and legal parent. Jackson was the biological father but had no legal rights. Nelson, who'd abandoned them and was biologically unrelated to Layla, was still listed as the father on her birth certificate. It was a mess. Jackson's lawyers filed paperwork to establish paternity legally. Filed more paperwork to have Nelson's name removed from the birth certificate. Filed even more paperwork to grant Jackson legal parental rights. Nelson, when served with the papers, didn't contest. Signed away his rights without argument. His mother called Lillian one more time, apologizing for her son, saying he was weak and Layla was better off without him. Lillian agreed. The legal process took weeks, but eventually it was done. Jackson Pierce was officially, legally, Layla's father. His name on her birth certificate. His rights established. His responsibility formalized. But the emotional process that was still ongoing. Lillian struggled with what this all meant. She'd built a relationship with Jackson as a friend, a benefactor, a confidant. Now he was her daughter's father. They were forever connected. Forever co-parents. Forever something. What were they to each other? Friends. Family. Something more. Jackson never pushed. Never suggested they should be anything other than what they were. Two people trying to do right by a child they both loved. But Lillian saw the way he looked at her sometimes. Saw the longing in his eyes that wasn't just about Layla. Saw the careful distance he maintained, like he was afraid of overwhelming her. And she felt it too. The pull toward him. The way her heart jumped when he called. The way she found herself watching him with Layla and feeling something warm and complicated spread through her chest. The way she imagined what it might be like if they were more than just co-parents. If they were something else. Something whole. But she was afraid. Afraid of ruining what they had. Afraid of him realizing she was just a poor girl from Mississippi with a GED and dreams bigger than her circumstances. Afraid he'd wake up one day and wonder what he was doing playing house with someone so far beneath his social class. Jackson had his own fears. Fear of pushing too hard. Fear of Lillian feeling obligated to him because of his money, his power, his ability to make her life easier. Fear that she'd say yes to something not because she wanted it, but because she felt she owed him. So they danced around each other. Careful. Cautious, co-parenting beautifully but keeping that final line uncrossed. Until Layla's first birthday. Jackson planned a party at his penthouse. Small, intimate. Just Lillian, Layla, Mrs. Chen from the old apartment building, a few colleagues from Pierce Technologies who'd become Lillian's friends, and Jackson's assistant who'd helped coordinate everything. The penthouse was decorated in purple, Lillian's favorite color, with balloons and streamers and a cake shaped like a unicorn because Layla had become obsessed with a stuffed unicorn Jackson had given her. It was beautiful. Perfect. Everything a first birthday should be. Layla was in her element, crawling around in a purple tutu, smash-eating cake, laughing at everything. Jackson followed her everywhere, camera in hand, documenting every moment. Lillian watched him with her daughter, their daughter, and felt her heart crack open. This was what family was supposed to look like. This was what she'd dreamed of when she'd first gotten pregnant. This was the life she'd imagined before Nelson had shattered it all. But it was better than she'd imagined. Because Jackson wasn't Nelson. Jackson was present and kind and genuinely in love with fatherhood in a way that was beautiful to witness. After the guests left, after Layla was asleep in a pack-and-play in Jackson's guest room, he and Lillian sat on the balcony overlooking the city. It was March now, still cold but not brutal. Spring was coming. Thank you, Lillian said quietly. For all of this. For everything. You don't have to thank me, Jackson replied. She's my daughter. This is everything I've ever wanted. Still, you didn't have to do any of this. You could have just, I don't know, paid child support and stayed distant. But you didn't. You showed up. Fully. Completely. He turned to look at her. The lights from the city reflected in his eyes. Lillian, I didn't show up out of obligation. I showed up because I can't imagine not being here. I can't imagine not knowing you both. I can't imagine, he stopped himself. What? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I can't imagine my life without you in it. Either of you. And I don't just mean Layla. I mean you. You've become, he struggled for words. You've become essential. And I don't know what to do with that. Lillian's heart pounded. Essential. I'm trying to respect boundaries, he continued. Trying not to complicate things. We're co-parents and that's already complicated enough without adding. He gestured vaguely between them. Feelings. Lillian supplied softly. Yeah. Feelings. He looked at her. Do you feel it too? Or is it just me projecting because of this whole situation? Lillian thought about lying. Thought about protecting herself. But she was tired of fear. Tired of walls. I feel it, she admitted. I've felt it for months. Maybe since the beginning. But I didn't know if it was real or if I was just grateful. Or if you were just, I don't know, caught up in the idea of fatherhood and I came with the package. Jackson laughed, soft and sad. Lillian, I fell for you before I ever knew about Layla. I fell for you through texts and phone calls when you were just a stranger who needed help. Every conversation made me want more. Every message made me check my phone 100 times hoping you'd written again. And then when we met, when I saw you, when I realized how strong and beautiful and real you are, I fell even harder. Layla didn't make me fall for you. She just gave me a reason to stay close enough to hope. They stared at each other, years of loneliness and longing between them, waiting for someone to be brave. Lillian was brave first. She leaned forward and kissed him. Soft. Tentative. A question. Jackson answered by pulling her closer, kissing her back with everything he'd been holding back for months. And there on the balcony, with their daughter asleep inside and the city lights below, they stopped being just co-parents and became something more. Something that looked like love. Something that looked like family. Something that looked like forever. We spend so much of our lives trying to control outcomes, trying to plan perfect paths, trying to force things to make sense. But maybe the best things come from the unplanned moments. The wrong numbers. The mistakes that turn out to be destiny. The connections that defy logic but somehow feel more right than anything we've carefully constructed. If this story is hitting you in the chest, if you're feeling what Lillian and Jackson are feeling, hit that subscribe button because you're part of this journey now, and we're not done yet. 6 months after Layla's first birthday party, after that first kiss on the balcony, after everything changed and nothing changed and everything changed again, Lillian stood in Jackson's penthouse, their penthouse now, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan and trying to understand how her life had become this. She'd moved in 3 months ago. Not because Jackson had asked, though he had. Not because it made financial sense, though it did. But because Layla called the penthouse home. Because she spent more time here than in her old apartment anyway. Because going back to the small, cramped space after being here felt like wearing shoes 3 sizes too small. Because Jackson had converted an entire wing into space for them, with a nursery for Layla and a bedroom suite for Lillian that was bigger than her entire old apartment, and it felt wrong to leave it empty. Because she loved him. That was the real reason. She'd fallen completely irrevocably in love with Jackson Pierce, and being apart from him felt like missing a limb. He'd been careful with her heart. Hadn't rushed. Hadn't pushed. They'd dated properly, if you could call it dating when you already lived together and shared a child. Dinners at nice restaurants where Lillian felt out of place until Jackson would make a joke about the pretentious menu, and suddenly it felt like they were just two regular people having dinner. Walks along the lake with Layla in a stroller, looking like any other family on a Sunday afternoon. Movie nights on the massive couch where they'd fall asleep tangled together while Layla played on her mat. It was domestic and strange and wonderful. It was everything Lillian had wanted when she'd first gotten pregnant, but better because it was real. Not based on illusion or expectation, but on genuine connection that had grown organically from the most inorganic circumstances. Jackson's world had opened to her gradually. The galas and charity dinners she attended as his partner. The business functions where she stood beside him, no longer embarrassed by her background but owning her story. The board members and investors who looked at her with curiosity at first, then with respect as they realized she wasn't just some woman Jackson was helping. She was sharp, capable, and quickly becoming an essential part of Pierce Technologies' HR department. She'd enrolled in online business courses, was working toward the degree she'd never had time to pursue. Jackson supported it, encouraged it, celebrated every completed class like it was a major victory. Because to him it was. He understood what it meant to claw your way up from nothing. He recognized the hunger in her, the same hunger that had driven him from that trailer park in Indiana to the top of the tech world. They were similar, she'd realized. More similar than different. The money and circumstances that separated them were superficial. Underneath, they were both survivors, both fighters, both people who'd refused to let their beginnings dictate their endings. Layla, now 18 months old, was thriving. She walked, ran, said 20 words, and had Jackson wrapped completely around her tiny finger. She called him Dada, a word that made him tear up every single time she said it. She had his smile, they'd realized. That lopsided, charming smile that made people want to do whatever she wanted. She had Lillian's eyes and determination. She was perfect. Wholly, completely perfect. The legal battles were over. Jackson was listed as her father on all documents. Nelson was a footnote, a signature on paperwork that erased his presence from their lives officially. The clinic had closed 6 months ago, its reputation destroyed despite the private settlement. Other families had come forward with concerns. An investigation by the state medical board was ongoing. Justice, slow and imperfect, was happening. But in their penthouse, in their life, there was peace. Jackson had asked Lillian to marry him on a random Tuesday in May. No grand gesture. No elaborate plan. They were giving Layla a bath together, and she'd splashed them both with soapy water, and they were laughing, and Jackson just asked, "Marry me." Simple. Direct. Real. Lillian, dripping wet and covered in bubbles, had stared at him. What? Marry me. I love you. I love our daughter. I love our life. I want it to be official. I want you to be my wife. I want us to be a family in every possible way. So marry me. Please. She'd said yes through tears. Yes without hesitation. Yes because there was no other answer that made sense. The ring came later, a custom design he'd made. Purple sapphires and diamonds because he'd remembered her favorite color. It was beautiful, but she would have said yes without any ring at all. They planned a small wedding. Just close friends, colleagues, and Mrs. Chen, who'd cried when they told her and said she'd known all along they were meant to be together. Jackson's business partners were surprised but supportive. Lillian's mother flew in from Mississippi, met her grandson-to-be and her future son-in-law, and whispered to Lillian that she'd done good, baby, real good. The wedding was planned for September. 1 year from that first desperate text message. 1 year from the wrong number that became the right everything. But before the wedding, there was one more thing they needed to do. One more piece of closure. In late August, Jackson arranged a meeting with the fertility clinic's former director, Dr. Patricia Morrison. The clinic had closed, but Dr. Morrison had agreed to meet with them privately. She needed to apologize in person. They met in a small conference room in a lawyer's office. Dr. Morrison was in her 60s, gray hair and tired eyes. She looked like she'd aged a decade in the year since the clinic had closed. "Mr. Pierce, Ms. Crawford," she began. "I don't expect your forgiveness. What happened at my clinic was unconscionable. The mistake that led to Layla's conception, it was the result of cost-cutting and negligence that I, as the director, am ultimately responsible for. I've thought about your family every day since learning the truth. I've struggled with the weight of how one moment of inattention altered 3 lives irrevocably." Jackson's face was unreadable. Lillian held his hand under the table. "I've spent this past year asking myself how to make amends for something that can't be made right," Dr. Morrison continued. "And I've realized I can't. I can't give you back the years Mr. Pierce lost not knowing his daughter. I can't undo the trauma Ms. Crawford experienced being abandoned. I can't." She stopped, composed herself. "I can only tell you that I'm sorry. Deeply, truly sorry. And that I'm grateful that something beautiful came from our terrible mistake. Layla is, from what I understand, a happy, healthy child. And you two have found each other. It doesn't excuse what happened, but I hope it provides some small comfort." Lillian spoke first. "We didn't come here for an apology, though I appreciate it. We came here for Layla. Because someday she's going to ask how she came to be. And we want to be able to tell her the full story, including this part." Jackson nodded. "What happened at your clinic was negligent and wrong. But it gave me a daughter I might never have had otherwise. It brought Lillian into my life. He paused. "It was the best mistake that ever happened to me. I can be angry about the negligence and grateful for the outcome simultaneously. Both things are true." Dr. Morrison wiped her eyes. "Thank you for saying that. We're not here to forgive or condemn," Lillian added. "We're just here to understand. And to close this chapter so we can move forward." They talked for an hour. Dr. Morrison explained the specific failures that had led to the mix-up, the systematic issues, the human error. She explained how the investigation had uncovered 3 other families who'd potentially been affected, though none with results as dramatic as Layla's conception. She explained how she'd lost her medical license, her reputation, her life's work. Lillian found herself feeling sorry for the woman. Anger was easy. But sitting across from her, seeing her genuine remorse, understanding that one mistake had destroyed her too, it was harder to hold on to rage. By the end of the meeting, there were no hugs or dramatic reconciliations. But there was closure. There was understanding. There was the ability to move forward without carrying the weight of unanswered questions. As they left, Dr. Morrison stopped them at the door. "I know this means nothing coming from me, but you're going to be wonderful parents. You already are. Layla is lucky to have you both." Lillian surprised herself by saying, "Thank you. Truly." The wedding happened on September 15th, exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after that fateful text message. They held it at a small botanical garden, intimate and beautiful. Layla was the flower girl, or tried to be. Mostly she just wandered around dropping petals randomly and making everyone laugh. Lillian wore a simple white dress that made her feel beautiful. Jackson wore a dark suit and couldn't stop crying. His vows were about wrong numbers and right people. About how the universe conspires to give us what we need when we least expect it. About how he'd spent years trying to become a father through planning and medicine and force of will, and in the end, fatherhood had found him through a typo. Lillian's vows were about survival and grace. About how she'd sent a desperate message into the void and the void had sent back a miracle. About how Jackson had saved her before he knew he had any reason to. About how some people come into your life as strangers and leave as family. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. After the ceremony, after the small reception, after Layla had been picked up by Mrs. Chen for a sleepover so the newlyweds could have one night alone, Jackson and Lillian stood on their balcony again. The same balcony where they'd first kissed. The same view. But everything was different now. Do you ever think about how unlikely this all was? Lillian asked, leaning into him. Every day, Jackson replied. One wrong digit. One typo. One moment of desperation. And it led to everything. Do you think it was really a mistake? Or do you think maybe it was supposed to happen exactly this way? Jackson considered. I don't know if I believe in fate. But I believe in this. I believe in us. I believe that somehow, against all odds, we found each other. My daughter found me. And whether that's fate or chance or divine intervention, I'm grateful. Me too. They stood in silence, watching the city lights, holding each other. You know what's funny? Jackson said after a while. What? I spent my whole life trying to build something permanent. A company. A legacy. A family. I forced it. Planned it. Tried to control every variable. And it never worked. The company succeeded, but everything else failed. Then I stopped trying. Stopped forcing. And you appeared. Wrong number. Unexpected. Unplanned. And suddenly I had everything I'd been chasing. Just showed up. Lillian smiled. Maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the best things come when we stop trying to control them. Maybe, Jackson agreed. Or maybe the lesson is that sometimes wrong is right. Sometimes mistakes are miracles. Sometimes the worst day of your life, that moment when you're desperate enough to text someone for help, that moment leads to the best thing that ever happened. Lillian thought back to that night. To sitting in her dark apartment with $4 in her bank account and an empty formula container. To the shame and desperation. To typing out that message with shaking hands. To the typo that changed everything. If she could go back, knowing what she knew now, would she type the correct number? Would she text Nelson instead of Jackson? Would she choose the intended path instead of the wrong one? No. Not a chance. Not for anything. Because that wrong number had given her Layla's father. Had given her a partner. Had given her a family. Had given her a life she never could have imagined in her wildest dreams. Sometimes wrong is the rightest thing that ever happened. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe knows exactly what it's doing, even when we don't. Some people call it fate. Some call it coincidence. Some call it luck. I call it grace, the way life catches us when we're falling and turns our mistakes into miracles. If this story touched you, if it made you believe in second chances and unexpected blessings, subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this, they remind us that we're never as alone as we think. That help can come from the strangest places. That family isn't always what we plan. Sometimes it's what finds us when we're brave enough to ask for help. Leave your thoughts in the comments, tell me where you're watching from, and remember, your next mistake might just be your next miracle. 3 years later, on a sunny afternoon in early fall, Jackson Pierce sat in his home office, no longer the cold penthouse space it had once been but warm now, filled with photos and Layla's artwork and evidence of life being lived fully. He was reviewing quarterly reports, but his attention kept drifting to the framed photo on his desk. It was a screenshot, the original text conversation from that September night 3 years ago. Lillian's desperate message. His response. Simple words that had changed everything. They'd had it professionally framed, a reminder of where they'd started, what they'd overcome, how far they'd come. He could hear Layla in the living room, now 4 years old, chattering away about her day at preschool. Could hear Lillian laughing at something their daughter said. Could hear the sound of home, real home, the kind he'd never had before. The company was still successful, still growing, still demanding. But it wasn't his life anymore. It was his job. His life was the voices down the hall, the sticky handprints on the glass, the chaos of toys and laughter and bedtime stories. His life was the family he'd found through a typo. Lillian appeared in the doorway, Layla on her hip. She looked different from the desperate woman who'd sent that text. Stronger, healthier, radiant. She'd finished her degree, had been promoted to Director of Human Resources at Pierce Technologies, was being courted by other companies for executive positions, though she had no plans to leave. This was her company too now, her family business. "Dinner's ready," she said. "And your daughter wants you to know that purple is the best color and anyone who says otherwise is wrong." Jackson laughed. "Is that so?" "That's so," Layla confirmed with absolute certainty. He closed his laptop and followed his girls to the dining room. The table was set. Nothing fancy, just Tuesday night dinner. Chicken and vegetables and the purple plates Layla had insisted they buy. Normal. Beautifully, perfectly normal. As they ate, as Layla told elaborate stories about her imaginary friend who was a dragon named Steve, as Lillian caught his eye across the table and smiled, Jackson felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. This wasn't the life he'd planned. Wasn't anything close to what he'd imagined during those failed marriages and fertility treatments and empty successes. This was better. This was real. This was built on the foundation of a mistake that turned out to be the most purposeful thing that had ever happened. After dinner, after bath time, after Layla was asleep with her stuffed unicorn and her dragon Steve, Jackson and Lillian sat on their balcony. They did this often, reclaiming this space as theirs. Their thinking spot. Their talking spot. Their remembering spot. "I got a call from Dr. Morrison today," Lillian said. "Oh. She's been working with a non-profit that helps expose medical negligence in fertility clinics, advocating for better oversight and protocols. She wanted to know if we'd be willing to share our story, anonymously, to help push for legislation." Jackson considered. "What do you think?" "I think," Lillian paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think our story ended well. But other families might not. If sharing what happened to us could prevent it happening to someone else, maybe we should. Even if it means reliving it. Even if it means acknowledging publicly what happened. Even then. Because Layla deserves to grow up in a world where fertility clinics are held accountable. Where mistakes like ours don't happen to other families." Jackson nodded. "Then we'll do it. Together." "Together," Lillian agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city below. Somewhere down there, there might be another desperate person. Another mother at the end of her rope. Another person about to send a message that will change everything. Jackson hoped their story might find that person. Might give them hope that rock bottom isn't the end. That asking for help isn't weakness. That sometimes the worst moments crack us open just wide enough for light to get in. "Lillian," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd typed the right number that night? If you'd reached Nelson instead of me?" Lillian was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes. But then I look at our life. At Layla. At us. And I think maybe there's no such thing as wrong numbers. Maybe every connection we make is exactly the one we're supposed to make at exactly the right time. Even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones. Because without Nelson leaving, I never would have been desperate enough to reach out. Without the fertility clinic's mistake, Layla wouldn't exist. Without the typo, we never would have met. It's all connected. All purposeful. Even when it felt random and cruel at the time. Jackson pulled her closer. I used to think success meant controlling everything. Planning perfectly. Eliminating variables. Building something that couldn't fail. And now I know that the best things in life can't be controlled or planned or built. They find you. Usually when you're not looking. Usually through something that looks like failure or mistake or disaster. The universe has a sense of humor that way. The universe, Lillian agreed, or maybe just grace. They stayed there until the city lights blurred and the autumn chill drove them inside. Into their home. Their life. Their miracle disguised as a mistake. In the nursery, Layla slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought her into existence. Unaware of the typo and the clinic and the abandonment and the unlikely connection. Someday they'd tell her. When she was old enough to understand. When she could appreciate the beautiful strangeness of her origin story. But for now, she was just a little girl loved completely by two parents who'd found each other through chaos and chance and a wrong number that turned out to be cosmically, perfectly, miraculously right. And isn't that what all the best love stories are? Not the ones that go according to plan, but the ones that find a way despite the plan. Not the ones that make sense, but the ones that make magic. Not the ones we choose with our heads, but the ones our hearts recognize before our minds catch up. A wrong number. A desperate text. A stranger's kindness. A mistake at a clinic. A DNA test. A truth that rewrote everything. This was never supposed to happen. And yet, here they were. A family built on impossibility. A love story written by accident. The most beautiful mistake that ever was.